Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Louis Frumkes, the director of the Hunter College Writing Center, and we are delighted to have as our speaker tonight, Debby Applegate. Debby is an historian, a very brilliant and gorgeous historian who wrote a book called The Most Famous Man in America, the biography of Henry Ward Beecher, for which she won the 2007 Pulitzer Prize for biography and was a finalist for the Los Angeles Times Book Prize and the National Book Critics Circle Award. In any event, Debby has come out just recently, I believe it was November, with a second book entitled Madam. And it's the biography of Polly Adler, icon of the jazz age. Polly Adler was one of the greatest madams who ever lived, and she lived in New York City. And the story of her life is this book, which I'm going to show you, called Madam, that Debby wrote. I can't put it down. It's a fabulous book. And so, Debby, I'd like you to tell our listeners about Polly Adler and Madam, and if they have questions, they can ask them after you finish. And anything else we can do, let us know.
Snacks. Will there be snacks, though?
Snacks.
Can't do that. Can't do snacks. Louis, thank you so much for having me here.
My pleasure.
As you well know, I was just saying we're old friends because I take a long time between books, and we got to know each other after the first book. This is only book number 2. It was a bigger deal to move from ministers to madams, from the 19th, 20th century to the jazz age, from the would-be saints to the unrepentant sinners. So that's why it took, I'm going to just say it, 13 years, because it did. I just went underground for 13 years. However, it was, to my mind, a great decision in many, many ways. Henry Ward Beecher, the subject of my first book, celebrity minister with his own sex scandal, had a lot more in common with Polly Adler than you might think. Both of them were icons of their own eras, and both of them were forgotten as history moved on. So part of what I do is bring people back to life. Polly herself liked to cast herself as a modern Horatio Alger hero. As she once said, a cynical person might say that my life has been a typical American success story. From the arrival at Ellis Island, up the ladder rung by rung, first $5 a week, $10 a week, $100 a week, a mink coat, a better address, from neighborhood trade to an international clientele, from a nobody to a legend. And there was much truth to this. Polly's, she said, a speakeasy with a harem was her phrase, were not just places for illicit sex. Her Manhattan brothel was an underworld salon of sorts, where the lowbrow and the highbrow mingled happily. As Polly put it, from the parlor of my house, I had a backstage 3-way view. I could look at the underworld, the half-world, and the high. Slumming intellectuals, Broadway bohemians loved her blunt realism and her louche wisecracks. Many in the underground gay community, both male and female, considered her parlor, I guess, a retreat, you would say, where they could relax and be themselves. Executives in the new field of radio, motion pictures, advertising, employed her girls to woo their clients. Wall Street traders passed along stock tips on their way to the bedroom. Gangsters used her place as an informal headquarters where they could meet with politicians and judges away from prying eyes. Gamblers, of which there were many, found it a safe haven, and everyone from Park Avenue aristocrats to East Side hooligans appreciated her ironclad discretion. She was arrested dozens of times, but that only fed her reputation as sort of the pinnacle of underworld chic. She was one of the authentic big shots of Manhattan, as one journalist put it, a behind-the-scenes power broker at a time when New York City was the most powerful metropolis in the world. Polly herself had tried to explain how she got here. No one is born a whore, as she once put it, and she most certainly did not. Pearl, as her family called her, was, by her own description, a good Jewish girl born in 1900, more or less, in a small town in the Pale of Russia in what is now Belarus. She was an unusually intelligent and confident oldest daughter. She was raised by her father as if she were a son. She was passionate about education and eager to see the world and make something of herself, to become a mensch, a person of substance. But as the old Yiddish saying goes, man plans and God laughs. When Polly was 13, her family decided to immigrate to the United States, but they did not have enough money to get the whole family there all at once, so they went one by one, and Polly, as the oldest child, was the first to go. She arrives in Ellis Island in December of 1913, and she went to stay with friends of her family up in Springfield, Massachusetts, people she didn't really know, but had been from her village, landsmen, as they used to call them. Then tragedy struck. World War I arrives. It cuts off all travel from Russia, most mail. She is now stranded among strangers here in the United States. She was forced to quit school and take a job in the paper factories, making only $3 a week, working 9-hour days, 6 days a week. She's miserable, she's poor and lonely. So at 15, she decides she's going to try her luck and move to Brooklyn, New York, where she has some cousins. Here in Brooklyn, things do improve. She gets a job in a garment factory where she makes a big $5 a day. She gets a raise. She still doesn't have any education. She still doesn't have any money, and she doesn't have much in the way of skills, but at least here she's got freedom, and she's got all of Brooklyn when Brooklyn was maybe at its earliest peak. She throws herself into the pleasures of Coney Island and the ragtime dance halls of Brooklyn, which we might know, as the Sunday school teachers will tell you, might have been the first step on her downfall. She was always cagey about how she made this transition from, garment factory girl hanging out in Coney Island to becoming a madam at the tender age of 20. There were traumas along the way. When she was 17, she was raped and became pregnant by her boss. And when he didn't marry her, she underwent an illegal abortion. Then she lost her job and she was kicked out of the house by her cousins. All the same, I think for those of us who haven't been there, haven't experienced this sort of thing, it's hard to understand what it's like to live in that kind of poverty and loneliness, and even more that sense of powerlessness and hopelessness. Whatever happened exactly, we do know, like many girls in her position, she decided that at some point she started to think that selling sex would be the easy way to get to a glamorous new life, the only way she could think of, one filled with clothes and camaraderie and cash. She decides that making a business of sex is almost, you might even say, doing right by herself in a rotten world. She opens her first brothel in 1920. It's right across from the library, Butler Library, and Columbia University. It actually might have been right where Butler Library is built, which I presume was because it had a built-in audience for her new services. This is the same year Prohibition takes effect, which has a huge impact. She insists it's just going to be for a little while. She's just going to save up enough money until she has enough money to open a store or to go back to school. And she very quickly does make enough money to do that. She opens a dress shop within 2 years on West 92nd Street. But very quickly, she sours on legitimate business. She was, I guess you could say, addicted to the high profit margins that prostitution offers. This is in an era when the average man makes a little over $3,000 a year. The average woman who's working makes half of that. At that time, she is pulling in $60,000 a year easily, which is now about the equivalent of about little less than $1 million a year. And even almost as important, she had power over her own circumstances. So in 1923, she goes back into the flesh trades. It is a fateful turn. She meets a very famous character who is probably more remembered than many of men of his era, a guy named Arnold Rothstein, a very famous gambler and political fixer. If you are a sports fan, you might know his name as the gambler who is accused of fixing the 1919 World Series. For musical theater fans, Rothstein, his secret floating crap games inspired the Broadway musical Guys and Dolls. Arnold Rothstein takes her up and he introduces her to all the up and coming bootleggers and gamblers of the era. That includes rising big shots whose names we all know, names like Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, Bugsy Siegel, and Legs Diamond. Her house very quickly becomes a favorite hotspot for these underworld players who are getting rich incredibly fast. All of this makes Polly more ambitious. As she put it, this is something she liked to say all the time, as I always told my girls, if you have to be a prostitute, be a good one. Well, the same applied to me. If I had to be a madam, I would be a good one. In fact, she now declares, I was determined to be the best goddamn madam in all America. Of course, she had some challenges. She couldn't advertise like a legitimate business, but she mastered the art of under the radar publicity. She parades, this is kind of her biggest technique. She parades through all the hot nightclubs and speakeasies with a posse of her best looking girls, picking up men along the way, passing out cards with her phone numbers as a way to show off her latest wares. She starts cultivating big newspapermen, gossip columnists like Walter Winchell, who was one of her steadiest clients. They don't put her name in print, but they spread it by word of mouth. And it works. This is one of the things I love about her, and that's a little like Henry Ward Beecher. She becomes the Forrest Gump of the jazz age in the roaring 20s, you might say, turning up in all the hot spots culturally. She becomes deeply involved in the world of Broadway, theater, the Friars Club, Tin Pan Alley. She was friends with many of the great entertainers and musicians of the era, especially in the jazz world. She hires and becomes friends with great names like Duke Ellington and Fats Waller, who often come and play at her parties. She entertained many of the great athletes. This is the golden age of sports, and becomes a big favorite among the Madison Square Garden and Yankee Stadium crowds. And her brothel, this is probably the most unlikely part, becomes a sort of after-hours clubhouse for all the writers, actors, and playwrights who have lunch at the Algonquin Hotel, the Algonquin Round Table, as we call them now. People who we would call cultural influencers like Dorothy Parker and Robert Benchley and George S. Kaufman. Their stamp of approval gets her in with the big money men of Madison Avenue, Park Avenue, Wall Street, and Hollywood. She counted Jock Whitney, Winthrop Rockefeller, and the Vanderbilt boys as regular customers. She becomes, in essence, a leading provider of what we now might call, or she even called, professional party girls, to cater to businessmen and politicians, all the people in the city who rely on women, frankly, to grease the world, the wheels of commerce and political power. The psychologists, I spent a lot of time trying to understand how this works. The psychologists call this the power of shared transgression, rebelling against the rules, indulging in the forbidden delights, things you're not allowed to do together, and getting away with it can create an instant camaraderie, a delicious feeling of secret power. As one auto industry salesman said very succinctly and bluntly, you get a bunch of guys in a room who don't know each other, you get drunk, you look at naked women, and the next day you're great friends, and then they sign a contract. Arnold Rothstein also introduces Polly to the army of crooked police and politicians who have run the city at the time. She becomes famous for her generous bribes to the vice squad, her $100 handshakes, as she calls them, and her wild parties where gangsters mingle with politicians and judges. New York's Playboy mayor from the 1920s, Jimmy Walker, was one of her most valuable customers. So one critic sums up the charges against Polly this way, just sums it all up. Here it is. She provided a liaison between the underworld, politics, the professions, big business, and desirable women. Judges' tips were bartered in her parlor. Racketeers and labor bosses formulated deals there. Police officers were broken or made, and candidates for public office gained or lost party support as a result of conferences held at Polly's place. So here I should stop and say we've come to what I consider the most controversial point in Polly's story. So I love research, and that's what I spent years researching her story, and had amazing luck. Clearly, the muses were looking down and favoring this project. And I found all kinds of shocking things constantly. But the most shocking probably was when I was speaking to a much older man. Now he's probably in his 90s. And he had known Polly back when he was in his early 20s, back in Hollywood, when she was young, when she was near the end of her life, and he was a young man. She was already suffering from the cancer that would eventually kill her. They're talking, and Polly confessed, just out of the blue, Polly confesses to him that Franklin D. Roosevelt was one of her customers. And this is around the time, she says, when he is running for governor, before he runs for president of the United States. She doesn't really say too much about it. He says she was just very matter of fact, except that she says, this was his quote, that she was being taken care of for the rest of her life by the contributions of Democrats in exchange for her silence when he ran for president. So as you can imagine, this added probably a whole year onto the research process, as it was many, many hours looking to try to figure out if this claim is true. And I should say up front, I was never able to be definitive about it. But I do think, and I did find much circumstantial evidence to suggest that it probably was true, certainly could be true without any hesitation at all. And it is also true that whether or not Franklin Roosevelt, who was a client of Polly's, she was very much on his radar when, as governor, he was preparing to run for president in 1932. So Polly is riding high when the crash comes in 1929, and then when the Great Depression sets in 1930. This is the moment where the national mood changes. All of a sudden, all those crooked politicians, those cops and colorful mobsters who had made Polly feel so influential, no longer seem so harmless. Suddenly, the underworld power brokers, all the power brokers who made her so powerful, are targeted by federal and state investigations. So now Polly's hard-won notoriety is a big liability. She gets swept up in all the nets of the feds and the state's authorities trying to shut down the bootleggers. By 1931, newspapers across the country are referring to her as the female Al Capone and the first lady of the underworld. However, she was more clever than the people hunting her down, and ultimately she managed to skate through all these political scandals relatively unscathed, unlike, say, Mayor Jimmy Walker, who is forced to resign in disgrace. To her surprise, when the storm finally passes in 1932, she discovers that all of this newspaper coverage, all this scandalous tabloid celebrity, has in fact only raised her reputation among the sophisticates of cafe society. She was powerful enough to escape prison until 1935, when she got swept up in the hunt for one of the biggest gangsters of them all, a guy named Dutch Schultz. He had been using her house as a kind of secret hideaway. Her trial in the summer of 1935 causes a huge media frenzy, but through the aid of her good friend Lucky Luciano, in the end, she only is sentenced to 1 month in jail, takes 5 days off for good behavior. She's down in the women's prison. Some of you who are New Yorkers will know it as the Jefferson Market Library. That was the women's court. So it's a beautiful place, but a place of much misery if you were on the wrong side of it. So she continues, she decides she's going to continue. She gets out through the fat cat years in the 1940s, the early 40s, the World War II. But by 1945, she's middle-aged. She's ready to retire, or she's certainly ready to get out of the underworld. So she starts looking about for an exit plan. Back in 1930, Abe Lastfogel, the boy genius of the William Morris Talent Agency, the legendary talent agency, he had urged her to write her memoir. And she had completely rejected the idea, far too dangerous. The tabloids would have paid plenty for it, but that would have just about covered the cost of her funeral. So as time goes on, however, she begins to think more and more about the advantages of becoming an author. Dozens of her friends were writers. Scores of people she knew had turned stories of gangsters and gold diggers into best-selling books and hit movies. Why shouldn't she? It was her story, after all. So by 1945, she decides she's going to close up her house. And like so many New Yorkers of that era, she moves out to Los Angeles. She goes back to high school and she enrolls in junior college, Los Angeles City College. Finally, after 7 years of work and many, many rejections from prudish publishers back in New York, in 1953, she publishes her memoir, A House Is Not a Home. It is a huge bestseller, instant bestseller. Goes on to sell 2 million copies. I think we would all be thrilled to have that kind of sales record. This story is whitewashed, of course. There was a lot she could not tell, a whole list of people that I found that she cut out and names changed. But it's actually a great book for what it is, a terrific book. I love it. I highly recommend it, even if it's only about 50% true, as her ghostwriter says. But this backstairs, even whitewashed, this backstairs chronicle of the early sexual revolution and the secret role that illicit sex plays in the decision-making of politics and business, it was a huge eye-opener for millions of readers. Polly gave the age of conformity, as we often refer to the 1950s, a shocking jolt, about on par with her fellow authors of 1953, Alfred Kinsey, Simone de Beauvoir, and Hugh Hefner. As it happens, she became a very good friend of Dr. Kinsey's, and she approved heartily of both the second sex and sexual behavior in the American female. Unfortunately, she left no comment on Hugh Hefner and the newly founded Playboy magazine, although I'm sure she had some thoughts. When Polly dies of lung cancer in 1962, there are dozens of long, respectful obituaries in newspapers across the country, hailing her as a literary lion, a symbol of a long gone decadent era. For her admirers, her brothels were an intoxicating playground for madcap modernists, for cutting edge capitalists in hot pursuit of new pleasures. It was a space where the imagination was allowed free play, unfettered by outside eyes and conventional rules. In turn, her customers and some of her employees, in fact, turned these experiences into fodder for the songs, movies, plays, books, all the daring new notions that would define 20th century popular culture. Second last, almost, to her foes, however, Polly exerted a sinister influence with powerful men whose after-dark decision-making affected millions of Americans. If we believe her claim that she procured women for Franklin Roosevelt, then that her discretion was critical to him being elected president, then her significance was even greater than her critics feared. Of course, and I'll end on this, what might be a high note, at least for her, publishing a best-selling book boosted her legacy. As one journalist observed, after all Polly's corruption of both men and women, when she cashed in her chips, what did the obituaries read? Of course, author dies. So I'll leave it there. I will say this, that one of the more gratifying parts of Polly's memoir and her notes was when she said, I mean, if I had known how hard writing a book was, I'd have stayed, wrestling cops and drunks and stayed in the sex trade, which, as somebody who mostly sits in a library, I kind of appreciated. It was hard for her too. So I don't know, Louis, should we see if we might have a question or two? Or,
yes, before we see about the questions from the audience, can we drop a few names like Frank Sinatra and
yes,
those who were pretty close to her, or clients? I don't know, but there were so many names that contemporary contemporaries would.
Oh yeah, and especially because it's hard to remember how unrespectable the entertainment industry was, how much the entertainment industry kind of overlapped with the demi-monde and the underworld, until really movies make them truly famous and big, larger than life figures. So that she knew so many people who moved from vaudeville to radio to film. Figures that we now remember, many we don't remember, but many like Milton Berle, who loved talking about going to her house. And in fact, it tells a story about being there with not Julius Garfinkel, what's his name?
Pretty boy?
John Garfield, yes. The two of them were hanging out at Polly's one day, because she also served food, so she had great food. They'd stop by for dinner, and Milton Berle tells the story about he is, I'm starting to feel a little horny. Julius, what do you think? He says, I feel a little horny too. So it's Polly, why don't we go back to our places and you can just send us some girls. So she gets on the phone. She's sending the girls to go meet them at their respective homes. Milton opens the door and there is his current girlfriend, Carol, standing in front of him. So she often had women who were wanting to be actresses, who were trying very hard to get their final break. And she says she had at least a handful of them who became real stars. One of them was Dorothy Lamour, not the biggest of all the stars, but one of the great names from the Bob Hope and for God's sakes, the crooner, Boom, Bing Crosby and Bob Hope, the Road to movies. Martha Ray, remember, of course, is the big mouth comedian, but was at the time a great jazz singer, was one of her best friends. Many of her clients included big names, all the band leaders, people, and singers like Jimmy Van Heusen, who was Frank Sinatra's close friend and major songwriter, was, I believe, the one who introduced Frank Sinatra to her. And there's a couple lovely things that Frank signs to her, and you can see the first one he signs right after he just met her. It's got all the formality of like a Damon Runyon character, to a lovely lady whom I am so delighted to have met and have heard so much about. Sincerely, Francis, or Frank, I'm sorry, Frank, but the next one is just Paul. The next time he sees her, he just signs, Polly, I adore you, Francis. One of the people who was most likely to talk about her were the ones who didn't give a damn about their reputations the same way. Humorists like Robert Benchley, who was my favorite character in the book, or the actor Wallace Beery, who was known as the most unliked man in Hollywood, but who loved Polly. And another favorite, Desi Arnaz. Desi Arnaz is one of the few who really writes about what it was like to be in her brothel. She cultivates him, gives him free nights on the town, and very quickly she becomes one of his best friends when he first arrives in New York, along with for God's sakes, all my names are disappearing. Not Diana Barrymore, the #1 debutante of the year. So he's got debutantes and hustlers and women of the night as his major fan base when he first arrives in New York.
And you really bring it alive in the book. I wanted to say this before, again, we asked Jillian for the questions. There was one thing that struck me that I thought was so cute that she did, and I wish I had one from my own little collection of business cards. She described her little business card.
Well, of course. So this is the age of the speakeasy. So one of the things that was quite fun is I immersed myself in the world, the culture and the world of these underground, I want to say flesh pots, really, because you could get, unlike a regular licensed saloon, you could do anything in a speakeasy. There was no law whatsoever. So there were ladies of the evening, there were drugs, the cocaine trade is wild in New York City at this time. So speakeasies had to give their cards out but they always were in danger of being shut down or having to move to a new place. So you would have just a little phone number, and you had, of course, to use your cards as special memberships. They called them memberships, but really it was just a way to make sure you weren't a cop. And so Polly's card is even more subtle than the average speakeasy card. It's just a parrot. Just a red parrot, like Polly want a cracker, and underneath it is her phone number, and that's it, and that's all you get. So if you don't know what the hell it is, good luck. Too bad. And she supposedly was very good at vetting her customers, and I think that's mostly true. But it is also true that she probably, if she had not been such an expert in bribery, she would have gone to jail probably a good.
Debbie, thank you for a fascinating talk. I can't again say how enjoyable this book is. I think someone would have to be nuts not to go out and buy it, because as interesting as your talk was and titillating about the people she knew and the life she led, the book brings it alive so beautifully. Really, really, it's a tour de force. Jillian, do we have any questions from the people?
I see one. Wait, I can actually see these questions. I see Miss Pressler has asked about her family.
Go ahead.
Did her parents, sorry, I'm just going to do it because I can see it right here. If you don't mind, it's easy for
Please
me.
do.
Did her parents and her siblings immigrate to the United States, and what were her relationships with her family members like? And this is a central theme in her own life. She's terrified of her family. She is terrified of her family finding out, which at first is not a problem because they're still in Russia. But then she personally earns all the money that brings them to the United States. And then she starts, much as she wants to see them, she wants to save them from all the terrible stuff that's going on in Europe. Then it becomes deeply stressful. She has to lie to them constantly. Luckily, they don't speak English, and so they don't read the English newspapers, and they're living out in Brooklyn, which doesn't seem as far as it was back then. They do not find out until she really gets caught in the webs of the investigations in the 1930s. Once she does, however, it becomes very sad and difficult for her. She adores her mother. There are stories that her family tells of her going out and seeing her mother every Friday for the Sabbath, and taking off her beautiful clothes and washing the floor on her hands and knees in her mother's apartment, which of course she pays for. One of them also described, an older lady said, oh, and we would always say, what beautiful girls she brings out to have dinner with us. Ruby Keeler, a little old for some of you, but Ruby Keeler was the sweetheart of Hollywood in 42nd Street. So that was a little bit of a shock. I'm not saying Ruby worked for Polly, I'm just saying they were friends. So once her mother knows, Polly is very deeply unsettled. They end up moving to Israel for a time, which is a great relief to Polly. But when they decide to come back, it's not easy being a pioneer in Palestine at that time. She is continually hurt by the fact that they will take her money, but they will not have her at the holiday table. They will not have her for Seder dinner. They will not take her. They will not have her to break the fast after Yom Kippur. And in fact, that story about FDR, the reason it came up at that point is the way the fella who told me tells it, is that in fact, right before she mentions it, she says, would you ever introduce me to your mother? And he says, well, of course I would introduce you to my mother. Why wouldn't I? She says, well, my mother won't even have me for the Seder. So isn't that interesting? They'll take my money, but they won't have me for the holidays. And he was sort of speculating that might be why she mentioned FDR and Roosevelt, as if almost to say, my whole life, I have been more important than anyone knows. And boy, all of these respectable men, all of these men who go on to the greatest honors, I know them in a way that other people don't know them, and I will never get their respect. And respect was probably her big obsession by the end of her life, in fact, I would say. Does she have descendants? Someone asked. She did not. She, like many, one of the things I became much more expert in than you might, well, as you might guess, things like, how the hell did people prevent pregnancy in these era before the pill and chemical drugs, and how in the hell did they deal with the epidemic, it turns out, of syphilis and gonorrhea? And so many people, and many young women who had abortions, and abortion is crazy common. It's easier to get an abortion than it is to get your hands on birth control for many people. Often you will find did not have children, because if you had an abortion at a time when you might have been infected with something, which was very common, or if you just had a poor abortion, a poorly done abortion, since all abortions were illegal, it made a lot of people infertile. So she never had a child. She never married. I think she always felt like, who the hell is going to want, what decent man is going to want to sign on for this life? But I did get to know a lot of her relatives, and I got to know her niece, who looks very much like her and remembers going to see Polly as a very little girl, and visiting Polly, and how wonderful and warm and special she was. There was something truly charismatic and special about Polly, even if there were many things that, that truly shock the morals, the average person, the average morality. I see one more question here, which is, have I talked to Lin-Manuel Miranda about turning this into a musical? You know what? He seems very busy. He hasn't taken my calls. There have been a lot of inquiries about movies. I should say this: Polly desperately wanted her book to be turned into a movie, and she did not live long enough to see Joan Crawford, who for many years had been rumored to have worked as a prostitute, as a call girl when she was in New York City, possibly even for Polly. Barbara Stanwyck, who also had some of those rumors, wanted to play her. Martha Ray, Ethel Merman, all of them were vying to play Polly at the end of her life in the movie version. I think she would have been absolutely thrilled. That would have tickled her more than almost anything. In the end, the movie is made in 1963, starring Shelley Winters, who many of you may remember. She was zaftig blonde, 40-something woman at this point, who'd had a good career, but had kind of a career playing prostitutes and madams. So I think it was easier to imagine. It is a terrible movie. A House Is Not a Home is the name of it. It's on YouTube. You can see a very bad version of it, and it's not great. But it did have a theme song by Burt Bacharach that became a big hit song, and it was the film debut of Raquel Welch as one of Polly's girls, Polly's Follies, as they call her. But Polly wanted desperately to have a musical made out of her life story as well. And she, at one point, corners Lucille Ball, that she desperately wants Lucille Ball. And there were rumors also that Lucille Ball had, in her early days, to those scrappy days when you're just trying to break into the business, had also worked as a call girl. Again, Polly never confirmed any of these rumors. She was very discreet, and all of those women went to their graves never admitting that, but it was just so common. It was far more common than people realize. This is an age where sexual harassment doesn't even have a name. That's how common it is, and especially in the theater industry. And I think for many women, young women, trying to just pay their rent, have a place to stay and feed themselves until they got their next break, you start to think, well, if I'm going to be chased around the desk, if I'm going to be fondled at rehearsals, If I'm going to be told I'm not going to get paid unless I put out, maybe I should just do it for a living for a while. So all right, last thing on that, sorry. I know this is the least savory part. There is a Jack Dempsey. She knew a lot of boxers. Jack Dempsey, when he later on became a saloon owner, became a great barroom raconteur. And he liked to tell a story of Katharine Hepburn, the actress, when she was just trying to break into the business in around 1928. And she becomes friendly with Dorothy Parker and Robert Benchley and some of the other theater crowds from the Algonquin Round Table. And they bring her for a late night nightcap to Polly's, which she's very shocked to find herself in a brothel, but they all act like it's perfectly normal. So she sits down and she kind of relaxes with a drink. An orange blossom, which was the hot drink there because the booze was so bad, you wanted to put as much orange juice on top of your rot gut gin as possible. And she's starting to relax when she realizes that Benchley has kind of wandered off to a bedroom, and her other companion, the poet H.W.H. Phelps, has wandered off to a bedroom. And then Dorothy Parker excuses herself to go see an exhibition, which I don't want to suggest what that might have been. And then it's just Polly and Katharine Hepburn sitting in the parlor. And this is how Dempsey tells it, that Polly leans over, kind of pats her on the knee and says, "Dear, I'm told that you would like to be an actress. Well, a good luck. But you know, that's a very hard row to hoe. Some days you might find yourself wondering how to pay the rent or how to feed yourself. And if that's the case, don't you worry. You just come to old Polly. I can always use a girl like you." And then she pauses and says, "On the other hand, you are a special type. Would you be willing to wear a nurse's uniform?" No way to confirm that. Hard to know if that actually happened, but it is clearly considered common knowledge that she would put her pitch in to anyone who was attractive and seemed like they might be willing. I see we have another question. What drew me to write about the biography of Henry Ward Beecher, and is there any connection between Adler and Beecher's lives? And I would say, well, I like characters, and I know you'll appreciate this, Louis. I like big characters with a good sense of humor, and especially a good sense of humor about themselves. I like people who are broad-minded and not judgmental, who look at the world as it is and yet still enjoy the company of people. And maybe that's certainly true of Henry Ward Beecher. The reason he became such a celebrated preacher, such a beloved cultural figure, is he could be blunt and realistic and loving at the same time. He could be self-deprecating, but also sympathetic. And Polly really had that. I mean, different circumstances, different kind of lives, but the same kind of character. And I think it's certainly true. I'm not a Calvinist, nor am I in any danger of joining the sex trade, certainly at this age. But I would say that I share that kind of orientation. As a biographer, and I'm sure this is true of many writers, you spend too much time with human beings, and I started, I think, very little of human nature. I think human nature, frankly, is poorly designed, poorly executed, not a lot to be said in favor of the way humans are built and the way we run. However, I really love the company of people. I really enjoy the scrum of real life and people being real. And that, I think, is the biggest thing they have in common. If you're going to spend this many years on a book, you have to like the people you're writing about. And I genuinely liked both of them.
Debbie?
Yeah.
Jillian, are there many more questions? Otherwise, I think I want to thank Debbie for a wonderful talk about a wonderful book. Let me show you once more what
Oh.
it looks like. It's called Madam, the biography of Polly Adler, icon of the jazz age. And it's an extraordinary story, it really is. And Debbie, you're an extraordinary writer.
Oh,
And-
Louis.
And you speak beautifully, and I loved having you tonight, and I hope everyone feels the same way. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you to you. Thank you to the Writing Center and to Hunter College and to everyone who helped make this, right? And I don't know if I'll be back because by golly, I'm not sure I'm going to do this again. So it really makes me feel great to be able to return. And thank you to everyone who came and watched and for the questions. Maybe I'll be back. It'll not 13 years.
You will be back. Thank you, Debbie.
Bye-bye.
Good night. Okay. There we go. Now, how do I get off?
Just click leave.
Not here.
The red button that says